This is how to put a round neck in a t-shirt, or you could use this as the binding on the sleeve, whatever. I'm just going to show you how to actually do it and how to figure out how big of a piece you need to sew for the ribbing for your neckline or your armhole or whatever opening you're going to use. So I've cut out my 2 pattern pieces from the patterns that I had. So here I have my front and my back. So first thing I want to do before I even actually get to these pieces is I want to figure out how big the piece has to be that's going to be the little binding piece that goes around the neckline. So in order to do that, you need to take your 2 patterns and you need to find that this particular one has a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So you need to overlap the actual stitching lines. So I'm overlapping them. You can take a piece of tape. I'm just, for now, going to actually just take and pin them. So I want to make sure that I'm pinning right on the stitching. So if you don't have a stitching line on your pattern piece, take a 1/4 inch mark and mark your stitch line. So next thing I'm going to do is, now I've got my neck opening so I can actually see the entire opening. So I'm going to take my tape measure. You need something that will curve. So I'm going to take my tape measure and I'm going to start on one side, and I'm going to start at the seam allowance. So I'm not going to start at the top of the paper pattern. I'm actually going to start in, so I'm starting in a 1/4 inch and down a 1/4. And I'm going to take this tape measure and I'm going to follow very carefully along the stitching line all the way around the neckline. I'm going to go around the back, across the back, and keeping it right on the stitching line, and I'm going to come to the other seam allowance line. So I get 12.5 inches here. Now if you have a bigger pattern or a bigger opening, perhaps what you want to do is you might want to fold your pattern so that it's folded on the center front and center back, and then you're just going to measure half of it. Okay, that may be easier depending on it. I like to go to the pattern because if you've been accurate with your cutting, then this is not going to be stretched out. This is going to be true to what the neckline is. So there again, I've got that 12-inch mark, or 12.5 inches. So what I want to do is, now I need my calculator. So I need to take 12.5, and you would round it up to the nearest 1/4, whatever you came to, or round it down to the nearest 1/4. Probably down is better than up. So mine was right at 12.5. So 12.5, I'm going to divide it by 8. So when I divide it by 8, I get 1.5625. So I now am going to take that number and I'm going to multiply it by 7. And I'm getting 10.94, so almost 11 inches. Now the reasoning behind that and the actual mathematics of it is, you want this piece of binding to be 7/8 as long as the measurement. So it has to be a little bit smaller in order that it will stretch to fit around. Now remember, you've got a knit fabric, so both are stretchy, and you want to make sure that when you do cut your strip, that you cut your strip with the grain line, so that the actual narrow part of it is going to be the stretchiest. So this piece, actually the length is the stretchiest, so this is much stretchier lengthwise than it is. There's absolutely no stretch this way. So if I had cut this out on the cross, or if I'd have cut it out lengthwise with my grain running parallel to the selvage, I wouldn't have any stretch on this. But because I've cut it with the crosswise, I've got a little more stretch here. Okay, so I've made a little pattern here that is 11 inches long. So that's roughly what I need here. Now I've left it 11 inches, but I also have a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance on each end. So I'm actually 10.5 inches. So I'm a little bit smaller than this measurement, which is okay. You can be, you know, on the little bit tighter side than larger side, because it will help the neckline fit in properly. So I've cut my piece 11 inches long. Next thing I want to do with it is I want to take it to the iron and I want to press it in half. So directly pressed so it's half the width. So the next thing I'm going to do with this is I'm going to go to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew these two short ends together, making sure nothing is twisted. I'm going to open it up and I'm going to sew across there, but it's just much easier than when I press it and open it with my little circle here, especially because this is so such a small little neckline, that it's much easier if I've pressed it before I actually stitch it in a circle. So I'm going to do that, but before I do that, I'm going to take my back pattern piece. I mean, it can be front or back, but for this demonstration I'm going to take the back piece. So there I've got the back piece here. So this is just a half scale, so it's not a full t-shirt. So this is my shoulder seam up here. This is my neck seam. So I want to reinforce this shoulder seam so that it's not going to stretch out when I take it to the machine or when I wear it. So I usually have all sorts of little strips of interfacing or something that's fusible that has minimal or little stretch in it. So this is just a piece of interfacing with a little bit of stretch in it. I've used white. If this was an actual t-shirt for me, I would probably use a black or something, but I've used white so that you can see it. So I've cut it into a 1/4 of an inch piece, and I've cut it the length of the shoulder seam. So now I'm going to take this and I'm going to press it along the shoulder seam. So you can see here where I've actually done that on this t-shirt, this back piece up here. So, and I like to do the back just for it's a little better. Sometimes the back will tend to be a little wider at the shoulder, so just in case I need to kind of have it a little more stable and not tend to stretch it out, I just like to, for me it's just a rule of thumb to do this on the back piece and not on the front. So now I'm actually ready to take this to the sewing machine. So before I do that, I'm going to take my little t-shirt half. I'm going to lay it with the right sides up, so the wrong side has the fusible on it. I'm going to take the front and I'm going to line up this shoulder seam on each shoulder. I'm going to put a pin in. If it's a short seam, you may be able to sew without any pins. So then I'm going to go to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew these shoulders. Okay, so here we are at my machine, and I've got it set up with a stretch stitch, and I've got my stretch needle in. I've got a contrasting color of thread. So I'm now going to sew my shoulder. I'm going to sew it with the interfacing side up, because that way I won't be putting as much pressure on the uninterfaced side that it will tend to stretch out. So I know that for a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, I want to line up my shoulder, my edge of my seam line with the edge of my presser foot. And I like to start in just a little bit, simply because if I'm using a stretch stitch, quite often they're a front and a back motion. So if you don't want to run off the back of the fabric before you start sewing. So I find I like to start in a little bit, then I can back stitch and catch the other edge of the fabric. Okay, so I'm just starting. I'm now gonna reverse it so that I get to the edge, let it go, and now I'm gonna stitch across here. Now, if you're stitching with knits and you find that they tend to stretch, it tends to be stretching out, I like to put my finger, I'm going to use my other hand for now, I like to put my finger right sort of at the back of the presser foot. So what's happening is, as I'm sewing, I'm kind of jamming the fabric up, like I'm slowing it down. So it's kind of gathering at the back here. I don't know if you can see the little bit of gathering. So I do a few stitches, I let it go, and then I come back and I kind of gather again. So what that is doing is it's slowing the fabric down as it's going under the feed dog. So it's kind of forcing it to not stretch out as much. So now when I get to this end, I'm going to go just to the end of it. I'm going to put my reverse on, and I'm going to reverse a little bit. Sometimes a stretch stitch doesn't require as much in reverse as a regular just straight stitch, because there's enough stitching happening. So I think you can probably see here, this is like a little bit of a honeycomb stitch. So now I've got, this is what it looks like when I pull it. Now, if my threads were matched, you wouldn't see that little bit of a white line here. So now I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to do the other side, and then I'm going to get my neckband sewn in a circle, and we're going to put the neckband onto this collar. Okay, so I have both shoulder seams sewn, and if you look from the inside, I have pressed the seams towards the back. So this is the front in my facing, and the back is behind. If you kind of hold it up, I know it's inside out, but you can see that the back actually comes up a little higher than the front. This is generally so. And I've taken my little band and I've sewn it together and pressed it open. Now when I sewed it together, I don't usually use the stretch stitch. I usually just use a straight stitch. This is not going to require any pressure or stress on it, so it's a little flatter if you're especially if you're using your sewing machine, if you have it so you can press it open. So then I just give that a little touch up. So now the next thing you want to do is you want to put everything into quarters. So I've got my center back here, which is very hard to see, but there's a little seam here. I fold it on that, and I put a pin in the mark where it's my center front. Then I take my center front and my center back where the seam is, and I line those up, and then I fold it and I get my side quarter points. So this band now is in quarters. To do the front, you do the same thing. So I line up my shoulder seams. So I line up this shoulder seam here and this one, make sure that they're right on top of each other, and I fold it and I put a pin in the center back, which is up here at the neckline. Then I take and I make sure everything's still lined up, and I put a pin at the center front. Now, because the back came up a little higher than the front, those shoulder seams are not necessarily going to be the quarter point. So now I'm going to take and open it up, and I'm going to match up at the neckline my center front and my center back, and I just lay them together, and then I put a pin at that quarter mark, and that's actually about probably 3/8 of an inch away from the actual shoulder seam. So then you'll see on this side I've got my quarter point here, same distance away from the shoulder. So now what I need to do before I start to sew is I need to pin these two together. So make sure you've got your back, and you take your banding piece and you line up where you've sewn it together in a circle, and that is your center back. So I'm going to put a pin here. I'm just going to do it sideways, see if I can get through this stuff. So I've got a pin there. Now you take your next quarter point on your band and you bring it over so it lines up with the quarter point on your shoulder, and then you put a pin in there. So you can, hopefully you can see that this here, the actual neckline is a little bit bigger than the banding, but with a little bit of stretching, it's going to stretch and fit. and I'm going to carry on around. I'm going to line up the center front of the band and the center front of the actual t-shirt, pin that there, and come around to the next shoulder and pin this little shoulder point here. So then I'm just going to take out the extra pins that I don't need, just so I don't run over them. Now this is pretty tiny, so it's going to probably take, I'm going to take and actually sew it sort of from the inside. So I'm going to take this, and again I'm going to have, this time I'm going to have the ribbing on top, because the ribbing is shorter. So I want to be able to stretch it to fit what is on the bottom. And that's really important with knits, is to put the shorter piece on the top and stretch to the bottom piece. Okay, so I'm starting at center back, and I'm not going to worry about back stitching right now. I am going to pull that pin out because this is so tiny, it's very close to the needle, and I don't want to end up having it go through. So I'm just very gently stretching that ribbing so that it sews smoothly onto the neckline. And again, this is a 1/4 of an inch seam. So I'm keeping my fabric. Now I've just realized that my shoulder seam is pushed forward, so I'm going to lift up my presser foot and see before I get to that shoulder seam, and I've been able to pull it back so that it's pushed back to the back. So again, here I am at the next spot, and I'm going to just pull this just a little bit. And I'm just very carefully pulling it around. I'm at the center front now, so I'm going to remove that pin. Wherever you can remove a pin, when you get to it, remove it. And I'm making sure that my shirt and my neck binding are staying lined up on the raw edge, even though I have to pull it a little. So it takes a bit of practice to not have to put so many pins in, but you should be able to just slowly go around and play around with your stretch stitches. You know, you may not like one as much for your seams as you do for hems or decorative stitching. So I'm just coming around the last 1/4. And what I'm going to do when I get to the back is I'm just going to overlap my stitches by a couple, because there's so much thread in this stitch. I don't want to have too many, I don't want to have a bunch of back stitches. Okay, so now when I pull this out, and I'm going to take it to the iron, I've got a nice little neckline that fits perfectly. It will lay nice and flat against your neck, and it's not going to poke out, and there's no ripples in the bottom. Now you could put a row of top stitching along here. I don't always do it. Depends on the fabric. This is a very stretchy fabric, and it doesn't have a really great recovery to it. So I think no matter what I did, if I stitched this down, I would end up having this stretched out, and I wouldn't be happy with the look of it. It just depends on the actual fabric and the stretch of the knit. So there's my little neckband.